Get him out. A homeless man was humiliated at a fancy restaurant until Morgan Freeman spoke up. We don't serve people like him here. Get him out. The words sliced through the warm, elegant atmosphere of La Belle Bistro, turning heads and silencing conversations. Maya Carter froze, gripping the edge of the serving tray in her hands. Just moments ago, she had done what any decent person would do. She had offered a bowl of hot soup to an elderly man shivering near the entrance. But now, standing in front of her with arms crossed and a look of pure disgust, was Mr. Harrison, the restaurant owner. And he wasn't just angry, he was furious. Is kindness more important than rules? Comment 1, or should rules come first? Comment 0. It was a cold winter evening in New Orleans, and the luxurious La Belle Bistro was alive with the quiet murmurs of high-class diners. The golden glow of chandeliers reflected off polished marble floors, and the air was thick with the intoxicating aroma of butter-glazed steak, aged wine, and freshly baked bread. The soft melody of a live jazz band drifted through the room, blending seamlessly with the clinking of fine china and hushed conversations about business deals, investments, and weekend getaways to Paris. For the past 3 years, Maya Carter had moved gracefully between these tables, balancing trays of expensive meals and pouring wine for people who barely acknowledged her existence. She had memorized the favorite dishes of wealthy regulars, learned how to anticipate their demands before they even spoke, and understood that her job was not just about serving food, but about maintaining an illusion of exclusivity, of importance, of a world where status meant everything. She had seen it all. Business moguls shaking hands over million-dollar contracts, politicians whispering deals between bites of filet mignon, celebrities hidden behind dark sunglasses sipping champagne, people who treated waitstaff as furniture, as if they existed only to refill glasses and disappear into the background. But tonight was different. Tonight, the person who stepped through the ornate mahogany doors of La Belle Bistro wasn't someone wealthy. He wasn't dressed in designer suits or silk scarves. He wasn't looking for a 5-star dining experience. He was an elderly man wrapped in a tattered, oversized coat that had clearly seen too many winters. His face, weathered by time, hardship, and unspoken stories, held a quiet dignity that even poverty couldn't erase. His gloved hands trembled from the cold, his breath visible in the warm glow of the restaurant's entryway. He didn't demand a seat. He didn't beg for food. He simply stood there, just inside the doorway, as if gathering the courage to ask for something so small, yet so unattainable in places like this. A moment of warmth. Maya felt her chest tighten. It was freezing outside. The kind of cold that cut through even the thickest coats, that turned fingertips numb and left lips cracked and bleeding. She had passed enough homeless men and women huddled against buildings on her way to work to know what a night like this meant for someone without shelter. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. She glanced around. No one else seemed to notice him. The hostess at the front podium, a girl named Rachel, kept her gaze fixed on the reservation list, deliberately ignoring the man's presence. The bartender continued polishing glasses, avoiding eye contact. The guests, draped in luxury, were too engrossed in their meals to acknowledge the cold wind that had slipped in with the stranger. For them, he didn't exist. Maya knew the restaurant's rules. She knew that La Belle Bistro prided itself on its exclusive clientele. She knew that the elderly man standing in the entrance didn't belong here, not according to Mr. Harrison, the owner. But she also knew something else. She knew what was right. Taking a deep breath, Maya stepped forward, her heart pounding just a little faster. She reached for a menu but hesitated. A menu wasn't what he needed. Instead, she walked toward the kitchen, grabbed a bowl of steaming soup, and returned with it carefully balanced on a tray. She knelt slightly, meeting the elderly man's tired eyes with a small, warm smile. "Would you like a bowl of soup, sir?" "It's on the house." For a moment, he just stared at her. His eyes, glassy, tired, but filled with gratitude, held the weight of years Maya could never understand. Then slowly his lips parted. "Thank you, miss," he whispered, voice rough from the cold. That would mean the world to me. She had walked over, leaned down, and gently asked, "Would you like a bowl of soup, sir?" "It's on the house." The man had looked up, his eyes glistening with gratitude. "Thank you, miss, that would mean the world to me." But before she could even take a step toward the kitchen, a voice boomed from across the room. "Absolutely not." Maya turned just in time to see Mr. Harrison striding toward her, his expensive watch glinting under the chandelier lights. His expression, pure outrage. "We don't serve people like him here," he snapped. "Get him out." The restaurant fell silent. All eyes were now on Maya, waiting for her reaction. She knew what she was supposed to do. She knew what Mr. Harrison expected her to do, but she also knew what was right. And she wasn't going to stay silent. What happens next will shock everyone, including the legendary Morgan Freeman, who was quietly watching everything unfold. Maya Carter's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the steaming bowl of soup. She wasn't nervous about carrying it. She had balanced far heavier trays in the chaotic rush of La Belle Bistro, but because she could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the restaurant watching her. The air had turned thick with tension, as if the very walls of the elegant dining hall were waiting for her next move. At the entrance, old Joe, the elderly man she had offered to help, stood frozen in place. His fingers twitched over the rim of his tattered coat as if he were debating whether to step back into the cold and pretend this never happened. And right in front of her, blocking her path, was Mr. Harrison, the restaurant owner. His face was red with anger, his lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "I said get him out." His voice was sharp, cutting through the low murmur of whispers in the restaurant. Maya took a slow, deep breath. She knew what was expected of her, but she also knew what was right. Maya straightened her back and met Mr. Harrison's glare. "Sir," she began carefully, keeping her voice steady, "he's not causing any harm. He's not begging for money or disturbing the guests. He just wanted to warm up for a little while." Mr. Harrison scoffed. "This is a fine dining establishment, not a shelter." Maya's jaw tightened. "And yet I don't see a rule that says we can't serve kindness." The restaurant fell even quieter. A waiter near the bar stopped mid-pour, a businessman at a corner table lowered his glass, and even the pianist playing soft jazz missed a note. Mr. Harrison's eyes flashed with warning. "Maya, I'll give you one chance to do what's right." Maya didn't hesitate. "I already am." A slow gasp rippled through the diners. Mr. Harrison's expression darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. "You're making a mistake," he warned. Maya swallowed hard, but she didn't back down. "No, sir, I don't think I am." She turned away from him, ignoring the pounding in her chest, and walked toward old Joe. "Here you go," she said softly, placing the bowl of soup and a warm slice of bread in front of him. "Take your time." The old man looked up at her, his eyes welling with something between gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you, miss," he whispered. "I won't forget this." But before Maya could reply, Mr. Harrison slammed his hand against the nearest table. "That's it," he bellowed. "Get out. You're fired." Maya felt the words like a punch to the stomach, but she refused to show weakness. She lifted her chin, placed the serving tray down carefully, and nodded once. "If standing up for someone in need cost me my job, then so be it." Mr. Harrison let out a short, humorless laugh. "Let's see how noble you feel when you can't pay your rent." Maya clenched her fists, biting her tongue, and then a deep, unmistakable voice broke through the silence. "That's enough." The room shifted as one, every head turning toward a table near the back, where a man who had been quietly sipping his wine now placed his glass down with deliberate precision. Maya's breath hitched. Morgan Freeman. He had been watching the entire time. Mr. Harrison blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Mr. Freeman, sir, Morgan raised a hand, and the room obeyed his silence. With a calm authority that carried more weight than Mr. Harrison's entire presence, Morgan stood up and walked toward Maya and old Joe. "You fire someone?" he said slowly. "For showing compassion?" Mr. Harrison hesitated. It's not about compassion, it's about standards. This restaurant has a reputation to uphold. Morgan tilted his head. And what reputation is that? Being known as the place that turns people away for being human? The businessman at the corner table shifted uncomfortably. A couple near the entrance whispered to each other. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. I run a business, not a charity. Morgan took another step forward. And yet it costs nothing to treat a man with dignity. A single clap echoed from somewhere in the restaurant. Then another, and another. Maya couldn't believe it. People were applauding. Mr. Harrison gritted his teeth, clearly losing control of the situation. You don't understand, he snapped. If we start letting people like him in. Morgan held up a hand again, silencing him. People like who? He asked, his voice smooth but piercing. People who have fallen on hard times? People who, by no fault of their own, need kindness more than ever? Tell me, Mr. Harrison, have you ever missed a meal? Have you ever wondered where you'd sleep on a cold night? Mr. Harrison's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Morgan glanced at old Joe, then at Maya. Kindness, he continued, isn't something you serve only when it's convenient. Mr. Harrison exhaled sharply. Fine, he muttered, waving a dismissive hand. Let him stay, but Maya is still fired. A hush fell over the room again. Maya clenched her jaw, refusing to let herself cry in front of these people. Morgan studied Mr. Harrison for a long moment, then turned back to Maya. You don't need to work for someone who doesn't value what you bring to the world. Maya's throat tightened. I still need a job. Morgan's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. Funny, he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a business card. I might know of one. Maya's fingers trembled as she took the card. Morgan Freeman's production company. She looked up at him, barely able to breathe. Are you serious? Morgan nodded. You stood up for the right thing. Now let me stand up for you. The applause grew louder. Old Joe clasped Maya's hand, squeezing it gently. You didn't deserve what happened tonight, he said softly. But maybe this was meant to happen. Maya exhaled a shaky breath, then smiled for the first time that night. Morgan Freeman nodded once more, then turned back to Mr. Harrison. You see, he said, his voice carrying across the room, the most important thing a person can serve isn't food, it's respect. And with that, he placed a $100 bill on old Joe's table, tipped his hat to Maya, and walked toward the door. The lesson had been taught. Now it was up to them to remember it. The hum of conversation had returned, but the atmosphere inside La Belle Bistro was far from normal. The diners whispered among themselves, stealing glances at Maya Carter, who now stood jobless after defending old Joe. Across the room, Mr. Harrison, the restaurant owner, sat stiffly, still reeling from his public embarrassment. His authority had never been challenged like that before. At the far end of the restaurant, Morgan Freeman remained seated, quietly observing everything. Though his expression was calm, there was an undeniable power in his presence. Maya gripped the small business card Morgan had handed her earlier, her heart pounding in her chest. Was this really happening? Could a single act of kindness truly reshape her future? Old Joe, still seated with his untouched bowl of soup, cleared his throat, breaking the tension. Miss, he said, his voice steady but worn, you didn't have to do that for me. Maya turned to him, offering a small, genuine smile. Yes, I did, she replied, because someone needed to. Morgan, who had been listening, leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. And that, he said, his voice low yet commanding, is exactly why she deserves better than this place. Mr. Harrison scoffed, shaking his head. Are we really making this woman a hero for disobeying simple rules? His frustration boiled over as he gestured toward Maya. This is a business, Mr. Freeman. We don't survive on good intentions. We survive by maintaining our standards. Morgan let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head slightly. And what standard are you upholding exactly? His eyes met Mr. Harrison's, unwavering and firm. Harrison frowned. Excuse me? Morgan took his time, choosing his words carefully. Are you telling me that the success of this restaurant depends on denying a man a warm meal? The question hung in the air. A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others murmured in agreement. Mr. Harrison stiffened, struggling to regain control of the room. "This isn't about one bowl of soup," he argued. "If I let one person like him in, then suddenly this place turns into a charity house. That's not what people come here for." Morgan sighed, shaking his head. "And what exactly do they come here for, Mr. Harrison?" He gestured around the elegant dining room. "To be seen, to feel superior, to measure their worth by how much better they are than the person at the next table." The restaurant fell silent again. Morgan leaned back slightly, his voice soft but firm. "A true leader understands that wealth is not about what you take, but about what you give." Mr. Harrison clenched his jaw, unwilling to concede. "And yet, Mr. Freeman, I still have a restaurant to run." Morgan nodded. "Indeed, you do. And tonight you've shown your customers exactly what kind of establishment you're running." A few guests applauded quietly while others exchanged knowing looks. Jonathan, a well-dressed businessman who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "I came here expecting an excellent meal," he admitted, standing up. "But what I didn't expect was to leave with a bad taste in my mouth, not from the food, but from the way this was handled." Other guests nodded in agreement. "Me too," a woman near the window added. "It's not just about fine dining, it's about how a place makes you feel." One by one, customers began placing their napkins on the table and standing up. Mr. Harrison's eyes widened. "Wait, what are you all doing?" A lawyer sitting near the bar sighed, reaching for his coat. "Taking our business somewhere else." The panic flickered across Mr. Harrison's face. "You can't be serious." Morgan exhaled, standing up as well. "Looks like your standards are costing you more than just one waitress." He turned to Maya and old Joe, nodding toward the door. "Shall we?" Maya hesitated for only a second before picking up her purse. She no longer belonged here. As she and old Joe followed Morgan toward the exit, Mr. Harrison scrambled, his voice desperate now. "Wait! Maya, let's talk about this." She turned, her expression calm but resolute. "Talk about what? How I should have looked the other way. How I should have pretended that a man's dignity was less important than a restaurant's image." She shook her head. "No, Mr. Harrison. That's not a conversation I'm interested in having." With that, she walked out. The air outside was crisp, the rain having settled into a light drizzle. The world felt different now, as if stepping out of that restaurant had lifted a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. Morgan smiled at her. "How do you feel?" Maya let out a shaky breath, a mix of nerves and excitement swirling inside her. "Honestly, a little terrified." Old Joe chuckled. "That makes two of us." Morgan reached into his pocket and handed Maya his business card. "That fear will fade. But the integrity you showed in there? That will last a lifetime." She stared at the card, her fingers trembling slightly. "And this job offer, it's real?" Morgan nodded. "Very real. I don't believe in rewarding people just for being good at their job. I believe in rewarding people for being good. Period." Maya felt a lump in her throat. She had spent years serving others, blending into the background of a world that rarely noticed her. But tonight, she had been seen. And more importantly, she had stood up for something bigger than herself. Old Joe clapped her on the shoulder. "Miss, I may not have much, but I know this. What you did in there wasn't small. It mattered." Maya exhaled, smiling. "It mattered to me too." Morgan glanced back toward the restaurant where Mr. Harrison watched, helpless, as one by one his most loyal customers stood, placed their napkins down, and left without a word. The clinking of glasses was replaced by an eerie silence. For the first time, he felt powerless in his own restaurant. Funny thing about power, Morgan mused. It doesn't come from money. It comes from respect. Maya looked up at him. And respect comes from how we treat people when no one's watching. Morgan grinned. Exactly. As they walked down the street, a new future unfolding in front of her, Maya realized something profound. Sometimes losing something small is just the first step toward gaining something far greater. Mr. Harrison stood inside La Belle Bistro, watching through the rain-streaked glass as Maya, Old Joe, and Morgan Freeman disappeared down the street. The restaurant, once filled with wealthy patrons, now felt empty, not because of the vacant tables, but because of the weight of what had just happened. He ran a hand through his graying hair, glancing at the waitstaff who remained, their expressions unreadable. For years he had believed that success meant control, that image mattered more than integrity. But tonight, watching his most loyal customers walk out, seeing the way Morgan Freeman had turned a simple act of cruelty into a moment of reckoning, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: regret. His grip tightened around the back of a chair. He had spent so much time maintaining appearances that he had forgotten what really mattered. Across the room, a young waiter hesitated before speaking. "Sir," he said cautiously, "maybe we should rethink some things around here." Mr. Harrison sighed, nodding slowly. "Maybe we should." Outside, Maya Carter took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill her lungs. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like just another waitress. She felt like someone who had made a difference. Morgan Freeman, walking beside her, glanced over. "How do you feel?" Maya smiled. "Like I just lost everything and gained something even better." Morgan chuckled, nodding in approval. "Funny how that works, isn't it?" Old Joe looked up at the sky, letting the drizzle hit his face. "Kindness doesn't cost a thing, but it's the most valuable thing a person can give." Maya exhaled, thinking about everything that had just happened. Morgan Freeman paused, then said something that would stay with her forever. "Respect isn't about wealth or power. It's about how we treat people when no one's watching." And as they disappeared into the city lights, Maya knew one thing for certain. She had lost her job, but she had found her purpose. Through this story, we realize respect is earned through character, not wealth. The way we treat the least among us defines who we truly are. A single act of kindness can change a life, even your own. Because sometimes the greatest thing you can serve isn't food, it's dignity.